terrible time in America. The stock market collapse of 1929 has sent the economy reeling. Across the country, businesses are going bankrupt, banks are failing, factories closing down. 12 million Americans, 1/4 of the labor force, are out of work. There is no welfare, no unemployment insurance, no social security, only soup kitchens and breadlines in the cities. The Grapes of Wrath is synonymous with the Great Depression. As Steinbeck was writing it, people were living it. It is both the story of a family, the Joad family, as they struggled to survive, and the story of an era. There is a new and growing class in America, the uprooted. These are the real-life people the Joads represent. They are not all from Oklahoma, but they are all labeled with the derisive term, Okies.
Even though it's a story of the Okies, it's a story of all of us in a sense that hope for something better. And there's that journey, all those jalopies on that road, Highway 66, all the way to California. I think it's the land of milk and honey. Turns out to be not quite that.
Set in rural Oklahoma, we meet Tom Joad as he is going home after 4 years in prison for killing a man in a fight. He runs into Jim Casey, a former preacher who's given up on organized religion, but is still searching for a larger meaning to his life.
He found that his family, they was gone.
The Joad's house is deserted. Tom learns from Muley, a neighbor, that his family, tenant farmers, have been evicted and are living with an uncle. Then Muley tells Tom what happened to his family.
That all I know is I got my orders. They told me to tell you to get off, and that's what I'm telling you.
You mean get off my own land?
Now, don't go to blaming me. It ain't my fault.
Whose fault is it?
You know who owns the land, the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company.
Well, I'm right here to tell you, mister, there ain't nobody gonna push me off my land. My grandpa took up this land 70 years ago. My pa was born here. We was all born on it. And some of us was killed on it.
They took Preacher Casey and loaded in a car, and his mother said, we've got to get away. His mother said, we've got to get away.
Homeless now, the Joads pack up what's left of their belongings. Everything else was sold for an old jalopy and a grand total of $18. The final moments mix sadness and excitement. They'll all go, Tom, who must jump parole, Ma, determined to keep the family together, Pa, the head of the family, but silently bewildered by the turn of events, a pregnant daughter, Rose of Sharon, and her husband, Connie, the Joad children, Grandma, and a very reluctant Grandpa. Casey comes along too. In California, he'll find the cause he's seeking, but he will pay a tragic price. The Joads leave behind a place where they belong. And they set off for the unknown. With high hopes and visions of a Pacific paradise. The Joad family heads for Route 66, what Steinbeck called the path of a people in flight.
The cars of the migrant people crawled out of the side roads onto the great cross-country highway, and they took the migrant way to the west. In the daylight, they scuttled like bugs to the westward. And as the dark caught them, they clustered like bugs, near to shelter and to water. In the evening, a strange thing happened. The 20 families became one family. The children were the children of all. Every night, relationships that make a world established. And every morning, the world torn down like a circus.
And that's part of the sense of, I think, this book is creating a new sense of family, the family of man, that we have to help one another in order to survive.
But not all of the Joads will survive to reach the promised land. Along the way, Grandpa dies. They dig a grave beside the road. No time for a proper burial. They have to get across the desert. Finally, below them, the Joads see the San Joaquin Valley of California.
They drove through Tehachapi in the morning glow, and the sun came up behind them, and then suddenly they saw the great valley below them. The vineyards, the orchards, the great flat valley, green and beautiful, the trees set in rows, and the farmhouses. And Pa said, God Almighty, the distant cities, the little towns in the orchard land, and the morning sun golden on the valley. Pa sighed, I never knowed there was anything like her. Tom said, where's Ma? I want Ma to see it. Look, Ma, come here, Ma. My God, Ma, you sick? Her face was stiff and putty-like. Her voice was a croak. You say we're across? Thank God, she said, the family's here. Grandma's dead. I told Grandma we couldn't help her. The family had to get across. I told her when she was a-dying. We couldn't stop in the desert. There was the young'uns and Rosa Sharon's baby. I told her. The family looked at Ma with a little terror at her strength.
Ma ultimately is going to have to reject the family and accept humanity. Before we can understand the dimension of her decision late in the novel, we have to see that the family is absolutely central, more important than an individual life. Grandma and Grandpa died. That actually symbolizes a break with the old that they knew. The other Joads are not yet aware of. They're not aware of how different it's going to be. And the new Joads, the younger Joads, are going forward into a promised land they don't really understand. When the migrants arrived in California, they came into a state that already had considerable turmoil of its own. California did not escape the Great Depression. There were lots of people here who were looking for work. There were a lot of people who were living marginally.
Another irony for the Joads and the other migrants was that by the mid-30s, huge corporate growers had taken over the farms. They had enormous power. And they had more workers than they could use. In a sense, California symbolized America for Steinbeck. It was paradise tinged with tragedy, power and powerlessness. The establishment versus the little man. And the ideas in The Grapes of Wrath would make the big men very mad. In fact, John Steinbeck was not a political man by nature, a quiet private man. He wasn't a protester or an activist. His profession was writer. But his first wife, Carol, who was something of a political activist, prodded his social conscience. She urged him to use contemporary events in his work. In 1936, Steinbeck wrote a series of newspaper articles about the Dust Bowl migrants now pouring into California called The Harvest Gypsies. He visited several migrant camps and realized then that these people would change Californian life, although he had no hint that they would change his too. Steinbeck was particularly tormented by a trip to a camp at Visalia in 1938, where he saw families living in cardboard boxes and children literally starving to death in drenching rains. He was enraged at what he saw. Now he was ready to begin what he called his big book. His wife Carol came up with the title, which was taken from Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. Steinbeck liked the thoroughly American flavor, hoping to blunt some of the criticism he anticipated. He insisted that all the verses be printed in the first edition. He dedicated the novel in part to his wife, to Carol, who willed this book. The manuscript finished, he wrote his agent, Elizabeth Otis, I want to go on record as advising against a large printing. this will not be a popular book. The Grapes of Wrath was published on April 14, 1939. It sold 428,000 copies in the first year, becoming the best-selling book of 1939. So far, it has sold over 14 million copies. The novel caused a furor, in part because of the profanity it contained, and then there was the stunning ending. Several communities across the country banned the book. In some places, it was even burned in the streets. John Steinbeck described the year after the book's publication as a nightmare. He actually celebrated when it slipped down the bestsellers list, but his life had been changed forever. When the Joads turn into their first camp, they find a collection of stunned and hopeless people. The Joads' California dream is about to turn ugly.
Sure don't look none too prosperous. You go somewhere else?
Want a gallon of gas?
But what do they actually find? Jobs are not available. They find barbed wire fences. Vigilantes are coming in and rousting these people out on the pretext that it's a center of disease, of smallpox, of typhoid fever that's going to poison the rest of the community.
Life is precarious for the Joads. Jim Casey is arrested after a row with the sheriff and is taken away. Rose of Sharon's husband abandons her, and Tom's anger is building.
You gotta keep clear. The families are breaking up. You gotta keep clear.
What's that, a detour?
Tom, please!
Just where do you think you're going?
Oh, we're strangers here, mister. We heard about there was work in a place called Tavares.
Yeah, well, you're heading the wrong way. What's more, we don't want no more Okies in this town.
The great landowners feared that this new group of migrants coming to California were going to be more easily organized into a fighting force. They're white Americans. They're going to be demanding the so-called American standard of living in California. We're going to have trouble from them.
The Resettlement Administration, a New Deal federal agency, ran some migrant camps of its own. They were clean and safe. The migrants lucky enough to live there set the rules. One of the camps was at Arvin, near Bakersfield. The RSA assigned its manager, Tom Collins, to be Steinbeck's tutor and guide during his research. He was so valuable that Steinbeck also dedicated the Grapes of Wrath to him, to Tom, who lived it. In one of Steinbeck's most poignant passages, starving people watch as crops are destroyed to keep up the prices.
There is a crime here that goes beyond enunciation. There is a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. The fertile earth and the ripe fruit and children dying of pellagra must die because a profit cannot be taken from an orange. The people come with nets to fish for potatoes in the river, and the guards hold them back. In the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling.
It's a moment in the book where he's almost suggesting some kind of revolution, that, the grapes are ready to be harvested. Something is going to happen. There's potential here for revolution. I think the book is suggesting some kind of collective action, and I think that was threatening to a lot of people.
Steinbeck was accused of being a communist, of inflaming people, of telling lies. As media coverage of the migrants' plight grew, people in the East were horrified and receptive to the book when it came out in early 1939. Soon the Joads were being discussed as if they were real people, and they became synonymous with the migrants as a class. Not everyone was sympathetic or believed Steinbeck's tale. Many called it obscene, filthy sensationalism. Were the conditions John Steinbeck wrote about really true, Americans asked? The veracity of the book got some powerful help from a woman in the public eye.
when Mrs. Roosevelt, who basically came out to see the conditions of the migrant workers, when she mentioned his name in his book, it completely changed the credentials of that particular piece of material, which up until then, people were saying was either an outright lie, it wasn't happening, he was distorting the facts. And to have Mrs. Roosevelt, who of course virtually everybody trusted, say Steinbeck is right, this is the way these people live, this is what's happening in our country.
As Steinbeck saw it, the nuclear family must give way to the larger family, the family of man. It is this collective vision that propels the final chapters of the novel. As the Joads arrive at a peach farm where they hope to find work, they are escorted through the gate by police. Some workers are striking for higher wages, and everyone is on edge. That night, Tom tries to discover who's behind the strike. He sees a tent and is surprised to find that Preacher Casey, who has been in hiding since leaving the family, is the ringleader of the strike. Casey tries to persuade Tom that the only way to survive is through organizing. He argues that if the strike is broken, they'll drop the pay for a box of peaches from 5 cents to only 2.5 cents. Tom resists.
Jim Casey is oftentimes seen as a kind of secular Christ, but organized religion is not his concern. His concern is the spirit.
They think they hear a noise, and they decide to run. They run into big trouble. Casey is killed by 2 vigilantes, and Tom strikes back.
Tom Joad took flight in the dark, rainy night, and
All the way through the book, Tom is kind of trailing along behind Casey in spiritual terms. And it's only when Jim is killed and Tom reaches down that he suddenly is converted as a doubting Thomas.
Dead, Casey becomes a martyr for his cause, and the seed of his redemption is planted in Tom.
I think Tom Joad in the novel has gone from a man who's just interested in putting one foot before the other, as he said, very self-centered, somewhat angry, but determined to get by, to a man who sees finally what Casey is talking about, sees that it's important to do something for other people, sees that you can't just witness injustice and not try to do something about it.
Now Tom is a hunted man. In one of the novel's most famous scenes, he says goodbye to Ma.
How am I going to know about you, Tommy?
Well, maybe it's like Casey says. The fella ain't got a soul of his own, just a little piece of a big soul.
We never hear from Tom again.
Tommy.
Now Ma is left shouldering the welfare of what's left of the Joad family. Rose of Sharon's baby has been stillborn. Ma and Rose of Sharon and what is left of the family are driven to high ground by the flooding and hope to take refuge in a barn. They discover a boy and his father in a corner of the barn. Ma asks for a dry blanket for Rose of Sharon. She asks the boy what is wrong with his paw. The boy says he's dying of hunger. Ma and Rose exchange looks, and Rose of Sharon gasps, yes. Ma smiles and says, I knowed you would.
I think that tremendously symbolic and powerful ending with Rose of Sharon agreeing to do something that's quite embarrassing, to nurse a dying man, is another kind of statement about how what you can do in the face of human tragedy. You can give of yourself.
Not surprisingly, that final scene intensified the storm of controversy that swirled around Steinbeck and his novel. That controversy left its scars and changed his life forever.
When he finished the book, I think he felt that a whole era of his life was over. He didn't want to return to the migrant material. He said several times, you know, the novel is dead. I'm not going to write another novel.
When it's all said and done, few novels of the 20th century can claim such a visible legacy as The Grapes of Wrath. But the story doesn't end there. It never does. Intolerance is always with us. Tragedy is just around the corner. There are always people torn from their homes, whether by war or by the force of nature. There are always hungry people living in poverty, and there are always people who will resent and fear them, which is why The Grapes of Wrath is still a classic.
Wherever men are fighting for their rights, that's where I'm gonna be, Maud. That's where I'm gonna be.
Keep watching Discussion Topics